Hello and welcome to the session on electricity generation. My name is Rob Nickerson and I am the Electricity Market Modelling Manager, and I'm responsible for all things electricity supply related within the future energy scenarios. In terms of the content for today's presentation, I'm going to start with some key insights before looking at our modelling assumptions, and then an overview of the results themselves, before going on to a bit more detail for a few key technologies, concluding with some key uncertainties, and then handing over to the Q&A session. So these are the key messages that we will see as we go through this presentation. Now, I don't want to give too much away straight up, but in short, net zero requires significantly higher capacities. It also requires bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, also known as BECCS. Generation output is dominated by 4 technologies by 2050, and a large increase in new flexibility technologies is required. So before we dive into this year's results, I'd like to take a few minutes to provide a bit more detail on how we do our analysis. This is something that many of you have asked for in the past. We included in the presentation last year, but I think it's also worthy of a recap here. There are far too many details to do it justice in one slide, but hopefully this is a good summary. Electricity supply analysis essentially falls under 2 components. Firstly, capacity projections, and secondly, dispatch modelling. Now, for capacity projections, we undertake a bottom-up approach based on an assessment of individual projects and technologies. This approach is informed by market intelligence and the stakeholder engagement that we undertake. It's also informed by the scenario framework itself and the lessons we learned from the electricity dispatch analysis. Speaking of which, for our dispatch modelling, we use a pan-European market model, and we populate that with FES as the data inputs. The inputs we're using are the capacity projections, demands, and the fuel and carbon prices. The economic dispatch model optimizes the generation needed to meet the demand at lowest cost, and it assumes a perfect market and perfect foresight. Now, because it's a pan-European model, we need to load in some European data, and we source that from ENTSO-E and some of our neighbouring European TSOs. We also have a method document if you'd like more detail on any of the modelling techniques that we use as we produce the future energy scenarios. Next, I'm going to take you through some of the main modelling assumptions. The 5 that I'm showing here apply to all of the scenarios. The first is that we assume and design to meet security of supply in all scenarios. The security of supply standard is the 3 hours loss of load expectation. The second of our assumptions is that when we develop our scenarios, we assume no network or operability constraints. The reason we do that is we want to understand what capacity the market would build if it had free choice of where to locate. And we don't want it to be influenced by a system architect type role. The results of our scenarios and the results of that free market choice on where to build is then passed to colleagues internally who work on publications such as the Electricity 10-Year Statement, the Network Options Assessment, and the System Operability Framework. And it's those ESO colleagues who assess what the future energy scenarios mean in terms of network and operability and put in mitigating solutions if they're required. Thirdly, we are assuming no unabated coal after 2025 in line with the current government policy. We're also assuming negative emissions are required, and they're required specifically from bioenergy with carbon capture and storage in the power sector. The reason they are required is so that the whole economy as an overall can achieve net zero by 2050. There are some parts of the economy where it's just not possible to remove all emissions, and therefore some contribution of negative emissions is required to be net zero overall. Finally, we assume that the negotiated deal with the EU closely replicates the current arrangements for capacity allocation and use of the interconnectors. Now I'm going to move the general assumptions over and bring on some scenario-specific assumptions. Hopefully at this stage you've all seen this scenario framework, but if not, a very quick recap. We have 4 scenarios this year arranged on a 2x2 matrix. On the x-axis is speed of decarbonisation, whilst on the y-axis we have level of societal change. 3 of the 4 scenarios achieve net zero by 2050. Let's start with the one scenario that doesn't, which is steady progression. In terms of the assumptions for electricity generation, we assume no CCUS, no hydrogen for power generation. This scenario also assumes the lowest level of renewables, and fossil fuels are providing flexibility. For system transformation, we're assuming high renewables, nuclear and hydrogen for power generation. And in this scenario, large power plants dominate. Of the 3 net zero scenarios, this is our most centralised. Consumer transformation has very high capacities to meet the highest peak. The capacities include high onshore wind and solar. Finally, for leading the way, again, there's very high renewables. There is low thermal generation, and as a result, this requires the largest amount of new flexibility technologies. So in terms of the results themselves, I'm going to start here with installed generation capacity. So because we're looking at capacity, the y-axis on this chart is in gigawatts. And I'll start by bringing on the data as it stands today. The overall capacity is driven by the peak demand. That's shown as the diamond overlaid on top of the chart. Overall capacity is also driven in part by the amount of intermittent renewables and the amount of flexibility in each scenario. Now, I'm not going to cover flexibility in detail in this session as we have a separate session this afternoon. In 2019, alongside the renewables and nuclear, there is a large amount of fossil fuel plant. This is shown in grey. By 2030, we see this starting to reduce, and it's replaced by strong growth in interconnection, that's shown in orange, and renewable generation, shown in green, lime, and yellow for offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar, respectively. Consumer transformation and leading the way have the highest growth in storage. That's the lilac area at the top of the chart. And this is required to support the intermittent renewables. We also start to see BECCS for negative emissions, as shown as the purple sliver in leading the way. Moving to 2050, we see capacity increases significantly. Fossil fuel plants are not present in the net zero scenarios, with hydrogen plant, that's the area shown in blue, introduced to help meet security of supply. Now we're including hydrogen rather than gas CCS in 2050, as the lower capital cost of hydrogen makes it more economic for low load factor running. This brings us to the first of our key messages, which is that net zero will require significantly higher levels of electricity generation. And in fact, in 2050, consumer transformation has 2.8 times more capacity than today. Now, those of you that have been to a FES session like this before will know that this is where we tend to move on to the next slide. However, that's not the case this year. We can bring on some additional capacity. This is specifically within leading the way. And we're assuming this will be offshore wind. Now, this additional capacity is required to run some additional electrolysis to produce hydrogen offshore, and that hydrogen is then piped back to shore. So this is electricity generation, but it is not connected to the electricity system. And to find out more about the role of hydrogen and an overview of its production, as a hint, it's not just from electrolysis in our scenarios. And then join the 2 p.m. session later today on hydrogen with Rob Gibson. Now we can also look at how this generation mix meets demand by looking at the annual output from different technologies. In this example, I'm showing the lead in the way scenario. The other scenarios are included in the publication and the data workbook. Because we're looking at generation output, the axis here is in terawatt hours, and it represents the annual generation. The points to note are that the use of fossil fuel plant, which is the area shaded in grey, drops quickest in this scenario. In fact, there is no unabated gas from 2037 on the electricity transmission network, and the smaller gas generation on the electricity distribution network may stay a bit longer. However, there are no unabated gas on the distribution network by 2045. Generation from biomass, which is shown in brown, drops when the subsidy is removed in 2027 and is gradually replaced by BECCS, which is shown in purple. And as noted, this provides negative emissions. Great Britain moves from being a net importer to a net exporter through the late 2020s and early 2030s. That's shown in the area in orange, specifically going below the 0 point. This is due to strong renewable growth within Great Britain, and the renewable output, some of that is exported to the continent. In the later years, net exports hover close to 0, and the reason for this change is that the increase in electrolysis means that less excess power is exported as it's converted to hydrogen instead. On the chart, we also see substantial renewable growth, which is shown in green, lime, and yellow. In fact, this brings us to the next of our key messages, which is that in 2050, 4 technologies provide over 90% of electricity generation in the net zero scenarios, those technologies being wind, solar, nuclear, and BECCS. So I'm going to look at a little bit more detail at a few technologies. The first one is biomass, and here we're looking just at the generation output from biomass, and I've selected consumer transformation for the chart here. Now we see that due to the removal of biomass subsidies in 2027, there is a sharp decrease in non-CCS biomass output. These non-CCS biomass plants then close or convert to BECCS, such that by 2050 there is very little biomass output without carbon capture. The BECCS capacity begins to ramp up in the late 2020s and early 2030s, and the BECCS output is high as the negative emissions are essential to achieve net zero overall. Indeed, that's the third of our key messages, which is that bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, also known as BECCS, is included in all of the net zero scenarios, with up to 9.6 gigawatts installed by 2050 in leading the way. This provides the negative emissions needed to reach net zero across the whole economy. Now we can look at the power sector emissions, but to do so, I'm going to first introduce a secondary axis. Note that the 0 point of this second axis is halfway up. And if I bring on the data, we see that the power sector reaches 0 emissions during 2032 in consumer transformation. The BECCS output continues to increase to offset emissions, and we see by 2050 there's substantial negative emissions from the power sector. Our assumption on limited bioresources restrict us from achieving further negative emissions. And indeed, this requirement to maximise negative emissions to support the hard to decarbonise elements of the economy, balanced with the limited bioresource available, means that BECCS within our scenarios is running as a broadly baseload technology in all of the net zero scenarios. Now, the fact that it's running broadly as baseload has an impact on other generation technologies, such as nuclear, which is a technology which would also normally run baseload, but also gas CCS. I noted previously that by 2050 we have hydrogen plants rather than gas CCS, and the reason being is the running hours of those plants have been squeezed, and the upfront capital cost becomes much more significant in the equation when you're looking to build low running plant. Now, in regards to the other scenarios, system transformation also reaches zero power sector emissions in 2032, whilst leading the way reaches this a few years earlier in 2029. Steady progression does not reach zero power sector emissions at all. The next area to have a closer look at is offshore wind. Here I show the capacity growth out to 2030 across all of the scenarios. Now, there are two 2030 targets: the March 2019 sector deal of 30 gigawatts by 2030, but also the government ambition of 40 gigawatts by 2030 from the Conservative Party's December 2019 manifesto. Alongside the line chart, the stacked bar shows the breakdown of projects as it is today. As is shown, there is a strong pipeline of projects, but there is little room to delay if we are to meet the targets. Indeed, the 40 gigawatt target is particularly challenging, as it would require an average build rate of 2.7 gigawatts per year. Now, this is over twice the size of Hornsea 1, which became the world's largest offshore wind farm when it went live in 2019, 5 years after it gained planning consent. Our net zero scenarios include a range around the two 2030 targets to reflect the degree of uncertainty around the consenting and financing processes. Finally, I leave you with this teaser. The chart here is from Consumer Transformation, and it shows that dispatchable thermal capacity is set to reduce significantly during the 2030s. Biomass is replaced by BECCS, and some gas is replaced by hydrogen capacity. Nevertheless, the total dispatchable thermal generation decreases some 60% between now and 2050. This leads us to the last of our key messages, which is that accommodating high levels of renewable generation and high levels of electrification will require a significant increase in short and medium-term flexibility. Now, I encourage you to join our 1 p.m. session on system flexibility to find out how new flexibility will enable the system of the future to balance demand and supply on a second-by-second basis. As with any long-term view, there are many uncertainties. Here are some of our larger uncertainties. Firstly, the development of offshore wind. There are uncertainties around the growth rate, the size of the turbines, and the location. There's also uncertainty as to when and if offshore hub networks may start to be built. Secondly, new technologies always introduce big uncertainties, and we've got quite a few technologies that this impacts. Next is interconnection and the impact of the decarbonisation strategy of our connected markets, plus of course the end of the EU transition period. And finally, the development of the supply chain to meet the large increase in required generation capacity, and particularly following the impact of COVID-19. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these uncertainties, plus many of the other uncertainties that impact the future of energy in Great Britain. The Q&A is a point that we could start discussing some of those uncertainties, and then we'll follow it with stakeholder engagement. There's always the email address as well, which you can reach us on. Now, I leave you with this summary of the key messages that we saw as we went through the presentation. These also appear in the written report, and I encourage you to take a look at that and the data workbook if you've not already done so. We will now move to a question and answer session, and for that, I'll hand over to our session host, Lauren Moody.